So good evening. This is the meeting of the Valley Stream
Hi,
Book
I'm
Club,
in.
and we are going to be talking about the book Valiant Women, and we are lucky to have the author Lena Andrews here. She's had a very wide career, and it's just like I don't know if I'm just so honored that she could make this meeting. Okay, so she's going to do a little bit of talking first, and then she'll have opportunity to ask questions then. I'm going to mute myself unless we need to, so just to cut down the noise, because I'm here at the library and I don't want everyone to hear that. Okay, so.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Lena Andrews. Thank you for having me tonight. I was just saying that, whenever I get invitations to talk to a book club, I love talking to book clubs, especially when they are based out of libraries. It unites two of my very favorite things in the world, which are book clubs and libraries. My passion for writing and for books and for history came from, being a part of, I've been a part of a book club since I was maybe 8. So, this is very much a joy for me. So thank you for having me. I'll admit bedtime is going on behind me. So if you see a little toddler in pajamas running around, I apologize in advance, but that is the blessing and the curse of Zoom. I'm glad to be here, beaming in from Washington, D.C. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would have been able to do this. So this is terrific. So as was noted in the intro, I've had a kind of varied career. And one of the first things that people often ask is how someone like me, a young civilian woman, found myself interested in and writing a book about World War II, and particularly a book about military history in World War II. I answer the question honestly, which is to say, up until, sort of my college and graduate school career, I wasn't really focused on issues of war and peace. It wasn't until I got to DC and was working at an institute called the United States Institute of Peace. And I noticed that in all of our conversations about conflict management and conflict resolution, there were people with uniforms in the room. And I didn't know much about those people with uniforms and what their ranks were and what all of that meant. And so I took it on as a personal mission to understand the US military a little bit more. That led me to do my doctorate in military operations in World War II. I focused on a really sort of niche battlefield component of battlefield operations in World War II. And it really gave me an appreciation for military history more broadly, how much I loved it, how much it was an interesting, not just story of patriotism and sacrifice and, sort of all of the things that you would think of when it comes to military history, but also of organizations and of people and of an employer, and lots of nuance and interesting things that happen in the military that a lot of people don't necessarily expect. But anyway, I graduated from my doctorate, thinking myself an expert on World War II. And it wasn't until I had a serendipitous visit to the Military Women's Memorial, which is a memorial in the National Mall right at the entrance of the Arlington National Cemetery, that I first stumbled on the number 350,000 women who served as volunteers in the U.S. military during World War II. And again, this is after I'd done years of research on World War II. So it was at first very embarrassing for me as a proclaimed expert on this war to have known nothing about this enormous group of women. To give you a sense of scale, that's about the size of today's active duty Navy. So it's a big number, and I had missed it. And it was really, as I said, embarrassing and then infuriating and then motivating for me. And it meant that, I spent the next several months and years reading basically every book I could get my hands on, every memoir, every secondary history of this war from the perspective of the women who served in it. And what I found was an incredible story. Not just of women, which of course, as you all know, it is, but also a story about supply and support operations in war and how incredibly important the full chain of military support is in combat operations. And as I hope you will have gleaned from the book, there's as much an argument about women in the book as there is an argument about military operations and the importance of sort of the unseen back end of the battlefield that many people overlook when they think of military operations. And I think today, especially as with the world in, in the state that it is, it's incredibly important for us to understand the full chain of what is necessary to pull off a world war, certainly, but even sort of smaller scale operations require an extraordinary supply and support operation. And by looking at women, we're able to, in World War II, we're able to see that chain in a really, I think, clear and elucidating way, a way that really helps us understand war more broadly. So for me, as a military historian who also happens to be a woman, who's also interested in women's history, this was like, manna from heaven. I had stumbled on this incredible story, and I just felt like I needed to tell it. And it was, part of my redemption tour for not knowing about it in the first place was writing this book and writing it well. So as you all know, from reading the book, I was able to talk to several women veterans who are still alive, which was the great privilege and joy of this experience. It was such, as a group, they are one of the most interesting groups of women I've ever encountered, groups of people I've ever encountered. They're also one of the funniest groups of people I've ever encountered. There's a lot of material on the cutting room floor, just funny stories from their experience. And it was, I think in the end, I ended up interviewing about 6 women about several times about their experiences. And I was really important for me to incorporate those experiences into the book and give it a little narrative texture to humanize this big, otherwise seemingly sort of big group of women. I also stumbled on some real heroes, which I tried to highlight throughout the book. Many of you may remember Mary Sears, which is one of my favorite stories. She comes at the end of the book, a woman who just really liked frogs and amphibians. And in 1944, that becomes incredibly important, an incredibly important skill for the U.S. Navy. And she goes on to advise admirals about her views on whether or not we should make these enormous landings, Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, those big names, which of course all of us know. We don't necessarily know women like Mary Sears who are putting all that together. So, the women in many ways are the anchor of the story, but as you all saw, there is so much more to the story when we think about supply and support operations. One of the themes, as you may have gleaned from the book, is about, for instance, one of my favorite examples is aviation, right? Because this is one of, and I don't think at any point I put it sort of in this way in the book, but this is the way that I personally think about it. Aviation and strategic bombing is, of course, the backbone of American air power strategy in Europe and in the Pacific. And the planes and the pilots that are a part of that are critical to executing the doctrine and executing it well. There's big debate about whether or not it actually worked, but let's just suffice it to say it did work, and it was important more specifically. And when we look at aviation and you think about the stories in the book, it's really clear how women are the sort of unseen, unsung backbone of this, and it can be the unseen and unsung backbone of operations like these. So you have women like, of course, Susan Ahn, one of the first Korean American women to serve in World War II, who is training the pilots on how to fly their planes, and these linked trainers, and is so good that she becomes a gunnery instructor later in the war. She's literally training men on how to use their guns. And you have one of my favorite stories, Anne Baumgartner, who starts the book in many ways, who's part of the WASP, flying around these planes. And then you have women like Jessie Contravecchi, one of the amazing women that I interviewed, who's really, really good at fixing altimeters and gauges. And one of my favorite things about being able to interview her was that in addition to telling me about her job, she could tell me things like, I was really good at my job because I had small hands. And that was really important when you were tinkering with, small little gadgets on a plane in World War II, and that you had to do all the screwing by hand. The women with small hands end up being some of the best on the machine floor. And she is certainly one of those. And she said, I can't remember if this is in the book or not, to be honest, but she said that the way she met her husband is that he was the supervisor, and he used to bring groups of men over, throughout the day to come watch her do her job because she was so good at it. And eventually, she couldn't tell if he was just doing it to see her more, or if she was good at her job, but it was probably a little bit of both. And she marries this guy. So it's, a lot of those little fun stories don't necessarily make it in, but they're a big part of it. But I love the story of aviation in that way, because at each and every point, from training to operations to maintenance, you have women who are a part of the story of how this important doctrine ends up manifesting on the battlefield. And I tried to make that as abundantly clear as I could throughout the book. And you can tell me about whether or not I succeeded. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments on that. But I hope that comes through really clearly. That is the key point in the book. Of course, there are also really terrific stories. One of the themes of the first part of the book is, of course, the leaders, the women leaders who took on such an important role in these women's services. And I had to I can't even tell you how much material I left on the cutting room floor about each and every one of these women who headed the services. They were so they were just such visionary women, and were sort of part of this cabal of women at the time in higher education who were leading the way on a lot of issues. Ovida Kalpabi, of course, is one of my favorites. Very complicated character, but very incredible face for the Army. Mildred McAfee, I went to the archives and got to read through her papers. I also read through Ovida Kalpabi's papers. I didn't put this in the book, I don't think, but she has a lot of correspondence with Eleanor Roosevelt that was just a total delight to read. It was not necessarily material to the book, but it's always fun when you get to read Eleanor Roosevelt's sort of personal correspondence with people. And then there were women who are mysteries. You might have noticed that Ruth Cheney Streeter, who headed the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. There's not a lot in the book, because there's not a lot on her at all in the sort of that I could generate, that I could find. And so it was, as a researcher, and a writer, it's always a challenge to sort of tease out how to create a story about someone who has very clearly kept herself out of the historical record. So those were really important for me to highlight the women leaders and the important role that they had, in addition to the larger supply and support story that a lot of these women as individuals were critically important. Women like I just mentioned, but also women like Charity Adams, who's one of my favorite characters in the book. And I think I definitely didn't I've said this before in other settings, but for those of you who don't know, there's a Netflix film coming out about the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion, which Charity Adams, of course, heads in Europe, and is very famous. I believe Kerry Washington is playing her. So in addition to getting the Congressional Gold Medal, keep an eye out for that Netflix movie. It should be excellent. It's being produced by Tyler Perry. It's a very big deal. So we're all very excited. Those of us in this little world are very excited about it. I won't go on too much longer because I want to get time for questions and hear what all of you thought of the book. But I'll just sort of, I'll end with a couple of observations about a few of these women who I'm just looking at my notes here. And I think one of the things that I feel very privileged as an author to be able to do is to highlight these stories, because so many of the women who I talked to and their families did not themselves highlight their stories. I think about women like Evelyn Zahn, who I highlighted, who drew maps in Normandy to help forces get around the backwoods of France. She never talked about her work with her family. It took her granddaughter months of pleading for her to even write a short letter about what she had done, just a record of what she had done. Women like Millie Bailey, who was part of the Adjutant General Corps and was a fixture in her community, was very proud of her service. It was a big part of her story. But, I think in some ways needed some prodding to admit that she had, to really acknowledge how important her role was in the war. This is someone who's critically important in the accounting of all the forces in Europe and in the Pacific. So critically important role, but she's just not one to brag about it. And I think as a civilian coming at this, just to return to where I started, which is, I'm not necessarily the typical person you would expect to be writing this history, but I am glad that I did, because I think, in my position as a civilian who can admire these women and in some ways can empathize, but not fully understand their experiences ever, I can also brag about these women and really try and get their stories out to a wider audience, and, call it for what it is, because I think many of them went home after the war, and went back to their normal lives. And normal in 1946 was housewives and pot roasts and dinner parties. It wasn't necessarily machining or gun training or whatever they were doing in the war. So it's been a real privilege for me to bring a lot of these stories to light, to get women to tell me their stories if where I could get them, or even just to highlight to families how important their aunts, their grandmas, their mothers were in this larger enterprise. And so that has been a great privilege for me. And also, as I said, a sort of redemptive act in the sense that for a long time, I thought, and I believed really strongly, that when you studied war, you studied war. That was it. Identity didn't necessarily come into it. It didn't give you a richer understanding of military operations. It may have been interesting, it may have been important, but it wasn't necessarily essential to understanding war. And what I found through this process was that actually the identities of these women as women was a critical lens that allowed me to really uncover a new layer of the war itself. And so for that and so much more, I'm very grateful to them for sharing their experiences with me. And I hope that comes through. I hope that it was part of the joy of reading the book. And if not, you can tell me, you can berate me now on the things that I've gotten wrong. There are many, don't worry, I'm aware. I keep a long list. But I do hope that's the goal that I've achieved. And for those of you who know veterans, I always say this at the end, and particularly since we're just coming beyond Veterans Day a couple weeks ago, particularly women veterans, I always encourage folks to ask them their stories and to listen really carefully to what they say. I didn't expect to be writing this book, but I asked, I listened, and the story was too good not to be written. So I hope you enjoyed it. That's the most important thing. I hope you tell all your friends about it, because these women deserve a lot of credit, and I just get the privilege of being the vehicle of telling their stories. So I'm gonna quiet down, because I realize it's almost 8, and I don't want to I want to have plenty of time for questions and hear what you guys thought about everything.
Okay, we're up for questions. So if anyone has any comments they would like to address to Lena, please feel free to unmute yourself and just speak up. Okay.
I thought you did a great job.
Thank you.
Just some of these women who were the original leaders, they had so much patience to deal with the men who were in charge. And I mean, it's a tribute to them that they stuck with it and got the women organized, and they were recognized with some benefits. So that was important. And this is still going on in society. Women aren't recognized, and it's an uphill battle for women.
Yeah. I mean, the point you make about patience is a really good one. I think I say this at some point in the book, but to a woman, all of the women in the senior roles who were heading the services were underranked for the size of the units that they were commanding. So, Ovida Kalpabi was by the end of the war, a colonel. She probably, for that size of a unit, 150,000 people, she would have been a general easily if she had been commanding men, which wasn't just a sort of a personal affront. It was also a problem administratively, right? Like she couldn't get access to the people in the meetings because her rank was so low, and the military is a very, hierarchical organization. So it was that combination of patience, of understanding that she was in this position. And also, I think a lot of the women at the top were great bureaucrats. They really had developed a professional savvy, a way to influence outside of their official rank that became very, very useful to them. Mildred McAfee, I only included a very brief snippet of this, but she has literally hundreds of pages of notes where she would be so mad that she would write out memos of what she wished she could say to her senior ranking officers. And it wasn't pleasant. It was like, they believe it. And she would litigate all of the points, and then she would file them away and never send them. But they're in her personal record. She included them in her Wellesley record, which I think is so fantastic. She's almost like begging a researcher to to put it out there and give them what they deserve. But they, but she never sent them. She never made the complaint too loudly. And I think it's a testament to what you say of the patience that this required. And I certainly think that is many women in senior ranking roles, both in the military and outside, have that in abundance today.
I also feel that it was great how you described what was happening during that period of time, that they went to college, which I didn't really realize. And I love the remark that you said they had to lie to get into the service, where the men were lying to get out.
Yep, exactly.
And one other point that really sticks in my head about the nylons. I remember we were in nylons and that they were painted on, which I thought that you put a lot of little interesting facts along with the other things that were going on. I thought it was great.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm really glad.
As fellow Valley streamers, it was really good to hear about how 99 started in Courtesy Field.
Yep.
And the fact that I think it was in the flyer in Baumgartner that she actually got to fly a jet at the end.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. Hers is an amazing story.
And the B-29 stories of how the men finally realized that the women knew how to fly it. And they had the exhibition, so the men would be jealous that the women were outdoing them.
Yep. Yeah.
And that the women follow directions.
No, I love that line. We followed the instructions.
I thought that was great.
Yeah. They the New York actually is really a hub of a lot of I think people forget this. They think of, the military now, especially the South, being the sort of hub for a lot of military operations, and it is certainly. But Mitchell Field, which was an enormously important coastal defense base during the war, is of course in New York. Hunter College, where all of the women were being trained it was in two places, but in New York, like you said, Curtis Field, like there was just New York was such a and for the record was a major target for the Axis as well, right? This is a place that they were actually trying to get access to on several. So the sort of hub aspect of it, I think, is forgotten today, but it was then, and it is now, remains a major military sort of a hub on the sort of wider spoke, and people just don't remember that anymore. But I love that. My mom's side of the family is all from New Jersey and New York, so I was you could see I had a couple of although I was told I said the wrong thing, which is it's supposed to be, now I've forgotten, it's either on Long Island and I said in Long Island or something. I don't know. I gotta go back, and that's one of the corrections by a New Yorker that was made for me.
I don't know if you know, Lena, that Curtis Field it's like the outskirts of Valley Stream.
I didn't realize it was that close.
It's very close.
Yeah.
And that's why when Barbara brought it up, the 99ers were a big active group here. And there's a marker at the edge of the town, or I think it's at the Historical Society from the Curtis Airfield. When they bulldoze it, they save the marker. So we are very aware of Curtis Field.
Oh yeah, if I write a second book, I'd love to write it on those women. They're phenoms. They're just incredible.
It was really great to see that yet another group of unsung pivotal people was being brought to light, and in many ways, it wasn't surprising that they had been overlooked. I'm curious, when the women that you interviewed look back 50, 60 years, do they feel that they helped move the needle?
Well, yes, I think, so what's really interesting about this group of women is they are one of the most, they have so much integrity about what they do and what they've done. In the epilogue, I talk a lot about how basically to a woman, the interviewees that I talked to and also the memoirs that I read, these women became like pillars of their communities. They were really, or in some cases, pillars of the country. Ovidia Kolpabi goes on to be in the Eisenhower's cabinet, and big public figures as well, but smaller public figures in their communities. And I think it reflects a really deep, and I think increasingly rare commitment to community and to sort of a almost patriotic impulse to serve in whatever capacity that looks like. And, and I think for them, it extended beyond gender. It was sort of like they were just compelled to do it because it was the right thing to do. And so then when I asked them about the legacies the doors that they kicked open, it was sort of like, that wasn't the reason they were doing it. They weren't doing it because they were women. They were doing it because it was the right thing to do. Their country asked them to serve, and why wouldn't they? So it was at times hard to sort of push them in that direction, to acknowledge the larger impact that they'd had. I do think they sort of are pleased with the impact that they've had, and many of them have gone on to be real advocates for women in the service. In particular, I just interviewed a woman in Cherry Hill, right outside of Philly, and she wears her women's vet hat every day, so that to this day, she's, I think, 99, almost 100. So that people know that women were veterans too. And I do think that's a very prominent theme in talking to them about their legacy and their contribution, but sort of acknowledging the wider impact that they had, and really kicking open the doors for women to serve, not just in the military, but in the larger national security community. It's almost like they're like, yeah, okay, sure, that's great, but I did it because my country asked me to. So it's a little bit of a tension, I think, in some ways, between the sort of patriotic impulse and the sort of feminist impulse of it. So it was, on occasion they would acknowledge it sort of quietly and like, oh yeah, I guess I was important. But again, that's part of why I felt so compelled to write this book, because if they weren't going to say it, then I felt like I needed to.
Now, you said that you discovered these women, and did you have difficulty doing your research, or like were there people who were not cooperating because they didn't want to share this information, or it was just or it was just neglected?
So it's a great question. So I conducted all of my research during COVID, which was not a good time to be doing research, I'll tell you that. So I had to totally reorganize the way. Normally when I approach any sort of academic project, which I thought of this in that way, I would do archival research first, and then I would go out and I would do interviews after that, and then I would sort of compile it all together and write a book. Because of the pandemic, none of the archives, none of the libraries, none of the institutions were open. And so I could get like a couple, maybe 10 pages digitized a week from each of these archives, but I couldn't actually go in and look at personal papers. So I had to do the interviews first, and I had to do them often with, women who were in some cases like 108 years old. So I wasn't going to go during a pandemic and interview them. So we ended up doing it on Zoom, which was a trip. It was like a very, very amazing how adaptive they were, with often the help of younger, kids and things like that. So in that way, it was just hard to get the research done. Silver lining, though, was in like 2021, a lot of these women were getting COVID shots, 2021, 2022, and they were being publicized on local newspapers. And so I just had a Google alert for women veteran World War II. And because they were getting these COVID shots, I was able to actually contact many of them. I found many of them who I would have never seen before. So the mechanics of the research were both complicated and easy in really unexpected ways because of the pandemic. In terms of the actual interviews themselves, it really depended on the women. Millie Bailey, who I talked about a little bit, was one of my favorite interviewees. She passed, I think 2 years ago now. And she she was like, it was like pulling teeth to get her to to get her to answer my questions, because she had done so many interviews and she had done so much of, you know, press around this. She was sort of like, ugh, you know, people had gotten it wrong a lot, so I think she felt a little jaded. So it took a little while to get her to trust me and to know that I was really after getting her story right. Once we got past that, it was the best. I mean, we had she's such an inspiration to me personally. And then other women like Joy Casino, who I talked to, she went, I asked her one question and she just talked for like 45 minutes and gave me great material. It's like, I didn't have to say anything. I didn't have to ask any questions. I just got anecdote after anecdote. So it really depended on the nature of the interviewee, as of course you'd imagine. But no matter what, I ended up, and there were actually, I think about, in the end, 3 or 4 women whose stories I couldn't feature in the book because they just didn't narratively line up in the right way. And I still wrote up their stories for their families because it was they're such good stories. I just felt like I had to do it, you know? So, so that was it. Yes and no, I guess, to your question, but it was all of them. Yes and no, but yes to having a lot of fun doing it.
It would also be great to hear some of their, hear them actually telling the stories during the interview. So if those are recorded in any way, is there, someplace in the future those would be viewable?
Yeah, so I've considered asking to add them to my website, just because this is something that a couple people have mentioned. And in writing the book and with the press around the book, I've gotten some great inbox, mail in my inbox from other people who have other documentation and stories and interviews. The Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress keeps a repository of interviews with veterans, which I really love. It's sort of so big, though, that it becomes difficult to man, because every war and every veteran, and it's a huge thing. The Betty Carter Center at the University, I think, of North Carolina also has a women's center, but same thing. It's a lot of stories. So I have thought about that, and I'm thinking increasingly about how best to navigate it. The Military Women's Memorial has a repository of their own, but again, covers all the wars. So I am thinking about just doing a separate page particularly of the Zoom calls, because they're a lot of fun. They're just like fun to watch. And my dad, who was here during one of the interviews, sat on the step, and he came up, and after he listened into one of them. He says, "You have to post these are so great," so you're not the only one. I think I've got to think about over the winter about the best way to make those available, even just maybe some cool snippets or little stories and things like that. It might be fun.
You said that there's going to be a Netflix on I'm sorry, I missed who it was going
Yeah,
to.
sure. No, it's the 6888 Central Postal Battalion, Central Postal Directory Battalion. And that is the group of the largest Army unit of Black women who served overseas. And they sorted mail in France and eventually more widely in Europe. And they were, at the time, mail was like a lifeline for so many people, because that was how you got news from home. And they cleared this huge backlog in the vermin infested warehouse in France, and they did it all despite extraordinary racism and sexism, and both from the local population and also from people who shared their uniforms. And so that it's a really compelling story, I think, in a lot of ways. And they got the Congressional Gold Medal a couple years ago now, I think, maybe, through the efforts of a group of Black women veterans who just have worked extremely hard to ensure that these women are getting the credit they deserve. And then also Tyler Perry is making this movie about them. So 2 very different types of credit, but I'm delighted that both of them are happening, both, sort of in the popular mind and then in the national mind. They are finally getting that deserved credit. And I'm just really grateful to the group of veterans who've kept their story alive, because, I wouldn't have, it would have been hard, it would have been hard for even someone like me to find it, because it had it not been for the very vocal advocacy of these incredible women. So I'm very, very happy about that. Keep an eye out. I don't know when it's coming out, but they were filming in like March.
If someone like Ken Burns did the women in World War II, some of these would really be all these stories and really would come out, because he's just think he gives us such gravitas, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I know. And he did a piece on World War II, or a series on World War II, which I really loved. And he's such a incredible storyteller. So if anybody knows Ken Burns, let him know. I'd be happy to talk. And I think there's some good stories.
What is the name of the movie that's going to be on Netflix?
I don't know yet. I think it's listed just as 6888 because that's what they were called, the 6888. But I'll ping you guys when if and when it comes out. I've been keeping an eye. I've got a little Google alert on that too.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other thoughts or questions, corrections? I'm always welcome. If you think something doesn't quite fit.
Are the women who you interviewed, have they had a chance to read your book, or you said that some of them have passed?
Actually, many of them at this point have passed. Unfortunately, a lot of them were 100 or 101. Like I said, my oldest interview was I think 106 when I met her, 108 by the time the book came out. But yeah, many of them have passed, and that's sort of one of the things that makes me very sad about this war, especially as someone who's a bit younger, is that so much of this generation and the sort of collective memory about this war is disappearing, and without the firsthand exposure, you lose a lot of the texture and the color and the richness and the nuance of understanding this war. I think in some ways, World War II has taken on a sort of swooning quality where it's just all patriotism and, glory and honor. When in fact, like any war, it was an extremely complicated and difficult time for most Americans. And when you lose this generation, you lose that sense of complexity and richness, I think, unless others, pick up that mantle. So unfortunately, a lot of the women who I've interviewed have subsequently passed. I think two are still living, and they have read it, and their families have read it. I sent all of them copies and letters of thanks, and so far they've all been positive reviews. Those are the ones I care about the most, of course, but they've been really. In some cases, they've sort of didn't know the story of the other services, which was fun to hear. An Army vet wouldn't necessarily know what the Navy was doing, and it was a learning experience for them too. So that has been one of the great pleasures, is hearing from their families about how they didn't really know how it all fit together, and now seeing it in one book, they can understand what their mom did, even though she'd subsequently passed or whatnot. And then, of course, with the veterans themselves. Those are the most important reviews. I had one woman who read it like literally weeks before she died, and basically was like her great last gift to me was to correct in red pen several things. And I was very grateful for that.
I had a question about the WASPs.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the women pilots had started in England first. They had a program before the United States, and Eleanor Roosevelt went to visit them as well. But then you write in great detail how the Americans deactivated the WASP unit here. And I was wondering if they deactivated it in the UK as well, or if that continued until the very end of the war.
So it's a great question. I don't actually know the answer. Better question than my answer will be, because I don't know the answer. I don't know the straight answer for you. But what I can say is that the British were in much more dire straits from a manpower perspective than we were. And so my hunch would be that it didn't, because I think, they were not only, and it's worth noting that every woman who served in uniform in World War II in the US was a volunteer. That was not the case in most other places. So the UK conscripted women into the service. And for that reason, had a much more mixed experience for a lot of women. I think many women were put into jobs that they just simply did not want. So I don't know what ended up happening with the ATA, which is what their version was called. But I do know that we learned a lot from the British, because they started it first. They had a lot of problems because of the things that I described, and also just because of the same, run-of-the-mill sexism that went on in the United States. But because of their manpower situation, my hunch is that they were unable to relinquish really anything before the war was over, because they were just so strapped for people. They couldn't let anybody go, man, woman, or in between. But there are some. If I could have written a bigger book, I would have written about all of it. You know, the Soviets conscripted women into real combat roles. The British did a lot that we were unwilling to do. Chinese did an incredible amount with women, most of the time out of necessity. But they really allowed them to do a great deal more than what we were seeing in the United States. So that's another book I will write for another day.
Did you get a sense for of all the service, parts of the military? Was there a quote better service for women to serve in?
That's a great question. There were definitely better uniforms. I'll say that. So the waves, the women, the Navy women were so proud of their uniforms. It was made by this designer, and it was like very elegant and chic with its navy blue and then the seersucker white. And the poor Army women had like, you know, drab khaki and like square hats, and it was not doing them any favors. So there was definitely a preference in that way. And I think, you know, each service has its own, even today, if you know anybody who's in the service, you know that like they all kind of rib and dig at each other in a playful and loving and a little bit funny way. And that certainly existed then. But I think honestly, it was more about the women's preferences, because like the Women's Army Corps, you could go abroad, which the Navy was only sending women to the Hawaii at the very end. The Navy, you could have access in some ways to a wider range of roles, and you had these killer uniforms. You know, the Marine Corps, you were integrated more fully into the service because the Marines were adamant that women be trained at the same facilities. Same thing goes for the Coast Guard. So they all sort of had their pros and cons, and depending on the women who, you know, the woman who served, it could really well match their needs. I heard a lot of women say, I went to enlist at the Navy recruiting station and asked them if I could go abroad. They said no. So I went around the corner and I went to the Army. They said yes. And so I signed up, you know. So Navy had better uniforms. Army had more access to other jobs. So it sort of pick your poison.
That's really fascinating. But now, because now, I don't know, there's so many, I think like in terms of women, the higher ranking women even in the Navy. I'm not sure,
Yeah.
but I think I've heard more higher rank women in the Navy. So that's why I was wondering if there was a branch that was a little bit more forward thinking.
Yeah, well, you know, Admiral Franchetti was just confirmed to be the first permanent member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She's a Navy admiral. So the Navy has led the way in many ways on that. But, you know, the Air Force also deserves credit where credit is due, because they were the Air Force. They were often using women in roles that were really unusual and you wouldn't necessarily expect, because they didn't have enough people and they were sort of already the adventurers of the group. You know, they were like on the cutting edge of everything, so they thought, why not incorporate women as well? But then the Army just had more women, so they were doing, you know, so it's like, again, it's a mix, it's a little bit of a jumble, and I think that's probably true today as well. You know, where one service succeeds in one area, another and fails, you know, in others, another service is really strong, and that's sort of what makes all of it work so well together, is that balance between all of them.
Well, I really enjoyed your book, and I didn't finish it. I still have like a couple of chapters left, so
I won't ruin it.
that's okay. I'm gonna finish it probably tonight or tomorrow.
Great.
But it was very personal for me, because it made me think of my parents, who told me all these stories. They had both been around in those, you know, at that time. My mother was a canteen girl. She was not in the service, but she was of that age. So it you know, it hit home with me. My father, you know, was in the Army.
Yeah.
And this was very relevant for me personally.
Oh, I'm glad. Well, I've heard from a lot of people, you know, with a sort of a tinge of sadness in some ways, that it reminded them of someone who they knew, who they wish they had asked more of And, you know, particularly like that aunt or that, you know, grandma or that mom, who they knew did something in the war, but they didn't have the story. Or in other cases, I get great stories like yours where people say, you know, I knew the story and I have a little box of her keepsakes, and, you know, what should I do with them? You know, and I love hearing those stories, because that's like when you know, you have, and it's inspired me to go ask, you know, my mom and my grandma, you know, where all their stuff was. But it really, for so many of these stories, because it was such a widespread war, it is essential that the families of this incredible generation sort of shepherd that history. And so I really encourage people to go find those little boxes and keepsakes and remind themselves of the stories if they're, you know,
I have a box of letters and I
Yeah.
don't know what to do with
keep
them.
them, scan them and send them to your kids and make sure they have them, or, you know, your family or your whatever, make sure they're somewhere. Because you know, I have my little box of letters too, and they're so transporting for people like me who want to write these histories. So thank you for keeping them and share them.
Well, when I think of a lot of the movies from World War II, the women are usually, like she mentioned, the canteens. They were the entertainment role. You
Mhm.
know, you
Right.
didn't really see them in military. They came and entertained the troops. I can't remember the pinups. You know,
Mhm.
so you never really thought
Yeah.
those movies don't give them a serious role, women a serious role at all.
And that was, you know, my initial, when I wrote my proposal to my publisher, that was what I laid out for them. I said, you know, the known narrative, the way that we present women in World War II is almost always as like a USO girl, or, you know, a pinup, or, you know, somewhere in the background, which of course women were doing all those things, and they're not unimportant roles. You know, they have like a really important function in the war. And certainly women in manufacturing, Rosie the Riveter, are critically important, but it's really the beginning of the story, not the end of it. And so, you know, again, part of this was just to be a corrective to that record, to say, yes, they were doing these important things, and also so many other very military tasks, you know, very central tasks. And so I'm glad that came through, and I hope that more people in Hollywood read the book and get some better ideas. I'm sick of seeing the same, you know, 3 types of women in World War II, in every World War II movie we've ever produced, of which there are many.
And this is definitely calling out for a documentary.
Yeah. One day one hopes.
Well, I want to thank Lena for coming tonight. It was a fascinating book. I think it was a fascinating read. And you know, we learned so much, that there's always another side of what you've learned. Well, like when I went to school, it was World War II was the battles, and then, you know, but there's a human side, and I think that your book really brought that to light, you know, and
Right.
especially a human women's side.
Yes, exactly. I'm so glad, and thank you all for reading it, for taking the time to appreciate these women. You know, they deserve it, and that's always been my goal. The more folks who know this story, the better, as far as I'm concerned. So thank you for being a part of this, you know, this mission that I'm on.
Is there
Thank you
going
for
to
writing
be
it.
a sequel, or what's your next?
We'll see. I've got a couple ideas. I am very intrigued by women in aviation at the turn of the century right now, simply because so many of the WASPs came from that community. But there are just, you know, as was said earlier, there are so many stories like this one of women who have been unsung heroes or unheralded, you know, really at the center of big moments in history. So I'm just sort of sniffing around to see what the right one is, and if I'm the person to tell it. That's always my main bar is, should I be the one to tell it? You know, what makes me the right person? So I'm still looking, but we'll see. Hopefully you'll be hearing from me again soon, or in a couple of years at least.
I'm sorry, I had almost cut somebody off. If someone wanted to say something.
I just want to say thank you for writing the book. It was so informative. I never knew anything about any of this. So it was wonderful to read about it.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you for reading it. I'm so glad to have you know, helped educate you on this. It's a wonderful story. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena. If my book club people can stay on for a minute, we're gonna just go over what we're doing next. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Have a lovely night.